Hello, and welcome to the MountPodcast, the official podcast of everything Mount Prospect. I'm your host, Howard Kleinstein, the Director of Digital Communications for the Village of Mount Prospect. MountPodcast brings intriguing interviews with the movers and shakers in the 56. This podcast will give you, the listener, inside information about the people who make Mount Prospect a place where friendliness is a way of life. Today we're talking to longtime Mount Prospect resident Gene Murphy. Gene is a former local beat reporter and has been involved in the origination and planning of some of Mount Prospect's longtime events and institutions. Gene, thank you for being here and talking with us.
My pleasure.
So, Gene, let's start with you. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, and went to high school there and so forth, and then went to college in South Bend, Indiana, at St. Mary's College, which is kind of part of Notre Dame, adjacent to Notre Dame. And that's where I met my husband, and he was a Chicago person. He grew up in Western Springs. So we got married, and I ended up here.
Okay. Well, what did you study in college?
I was an English writing major because I wanted to be a journalist, which I ended up being, and my minor was history.
Okay, that's
So I definitely followed what I was, looking to do.
that's right, and we'll get into more about history in a little bit. So, your husband was a Chicagoan. He wasn't a Mount Prospector.
No.
How did you guys end up coming to Mount Prospect?
Well, it's kind of funny because he grew up in Western Springs and then ended up working up in the northern suburbs. But his aunt and uncle had lived in Mount Prospect for many years, from the early 50s. And he remembered coming to Mount Prospect fondly. And since he had a job in Northbrook, we looked here and ended up here.
When was that?
That would have been 1982.
Okay,
1982.
all right.
Okay.
What was other than the fact your husband had some familiarity with Mount Prospect? Was there anything else that attracted you to Mount Prospect at the time?
Um, we really liked the old houses. We didn't end up living in one, but we really liked the old houses. I, as I had told you, was a history minor, and my first job in Chicago was working as director of public relations for the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio
Oh,
in Oak Park, and so that got me into architecture,
mm,
and started on a lot of other things that I ended up doing. I would say a lot of it was the architecture of the area that drew us.
okay. Can you tell me more about what you did for the Frank Lloyd Wright
Sure, the
what
home and studio.
home and studio? Yeah.
Yes, I was hired as their first public relations director.
Uh-huh.
So I'm the one who took the Chicago Tribune or the whoever around to see everything in Oak Park. And at the time I was working there, they were in the midst of their massive renovation and restoration of
Mm.
that building. So my office was with the director of the restoration, and he and I sat across a huge like drawing table from each other in the children's bedroom, and that's where our office was, because at that point everybody had their office in the actual museum.
Okay. Yeah.
And but I can remember having meetings around his Frank Lloyd Wright's fabulous dining room, and it was a wonderful place to work.
Yeah, I remember I took a couple of architectural drawing classes in high school, and we did a tour there probably a little before you were there, but it was quite impressive. Uh, so, so how does Mount Prospect stack up architecturally wise? The older Mount Prospect, I guess.
Well, I love Mount Prospect, but it doesn't compare to Oak Park, I
No.
have to admit. When you've got a town like Oak Park that has all these
Yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and so forth, it's hard to compete. But I had worked on their big house walk there,
Hmm.
which they call Right Plus. And that's where I kind of learned how to do a house walk.
Mm.
And then I ended up starting the house walk in Mount Prospect because I felt that even though it wasn't Oak Park, it had a lot to offer when
Right.
it came to, seeing the old houses and seeing the new houses.
Okay. So, so you moved to Mount Prospect, and you got a job in as a journalist. Who did you first start working for here?
Well, it was kind of interesting. While I was working for the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio, I decided to do freelancing on the side for the Daily Herald. And that's how I ended up working for the Daily Herald. So I continued to work for the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio until I had children. And then I quit working there. And while I was raising my children, went and worked part time for the Daily Herald. And it progressed from there.
And what kind of things were you writing for the Daily Herald?
Oh, over the years, I've written everything. I've covered board meetings for the various villages and the school boards, and I did a lot of real estate reporting. I did neighborhood type things. At one point, for a very long point, actually, I was the Mount Prospect columnist for the Daily Herald. In the old days, every town had a columnist. And at one point, I was writing 3 columns a week
Mm.
for Mount Prospect. And it would be, the short little things where it would be a paragraph or two about one thing, and then I jumped to another thing and kept people very up to date on what was happening all over town.
Okay. So, so you're writing articles about Mount Prospect in the area. When did you first get involved with kind of the behind the scenes things in Mount Prospect? I know were helped start the historical society.
Well, not really, because I'm not that old. But
Okay.
what happened was that one of my assignments for the Daily Herald was to interview Dolores Howe,
Mm-hmm.
who was one of the founders of the Historical Society. And so while I was interviewing her, I happened to say, well, I think you guys should start a house walk because I had been doing it in
Right.
Oak Park. And Dolores was never one to miss an opportunity. And she practically jumped at me and said, that would be great because at that point they were raising money to restore the Dietrich Friedrichs house.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed all the money they could get. So my idea of a house walk in Mount Prospect really set her off. So I thought about it, and she kept calling me and wanting me to run a house walk for them. And finally, I thought, well, what the heck, why not? So I put together the first house walk, and we only sold 300 tickets. We did it on a Sunday afternoon. We sold out immediately, but we weren't raising big money at that point. And it went so well. And also at that point, I should say, now we do the house walk where it's neighborhoods. So you maybe see 5 or 6 houses that are all within walking distance of one
Right.
another. But that was not the way it was at the beginning.
No.
No, you got in your car and you drove to
Oh.
different houses.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was for the first 5 years.
Okay.
And I have to say it was much easier because we didn't have to try and find 5 or 6 houses all right near each other. So we had them all over town, and it was on a Sunday afternoon, and people just loved it, absolutely loved it. So we gradually kept printing more tickets and increasing the number of people as we got our feet wet, and of course made all kinds of changes. We added a tent or some other place to start where you can hand out programs and it's changed a lot over the years, but now it is by far the Historical Society's largest fundraiser, and the society really, really depends on it every year.
About how many people do you think are currently going through the house walk? How many tickets are they selling these days?
It really depends. This past year it was about 800.
Okay.
So, and I think we're pretty, unless you want to try and sell them by time, which we don't want to
Right.
do. I think we're, pretty much at capacity.
Yeah, I know I've videotaped many house walks, and it gets pretty crowded where people can't get in the house and they're
Lined up,
waiting lined up out on the front porch and down the sidewalk. So
right?
it's a very successful event, and if you haven't gone, please feel free to go next year. They have it every year, and it's usually the first Friday in December.
Well, it's the Friday after Thanksgiving. Every once in a while, that happens to be like November 30th,
Oh,
but
yeah,
usually, it's the first Friday of December. Just
yeah.
depends on the calendar.
Okay, so you've been working with the Historical Society since when?
Probably, I interviewed Dolores in '84. Probably, I started the house walk in '87.
Okay.
Or no, it was the first one was '88. Because the funny part about that house walk is, at the time we actually held the house walk at the beginning of December, my youngest child was 2 months old.
Okay.
So that's how I know it was
Okay.
1988.
Yeah. So, in addition to the work you've done with the Historical Society, you've written probably the definitive historical account of Mount Prospect. It's Mount Prospect where town and country meets. You wrote this in 92,
91, or
91.
I think it came out
Yeah,
in '92, but I wrote it in
right.
'91
And
with the able assistance of Mary Wager, who did all the research for me on that book.
okay. It's quite a good book about the history of Mount Prospect, and we've done many historical videos here at MPDC, and we use it as a reference all the time, and so it's great. Tell me about how you got the idea to write it and how you got it published.
Well, that's an interesting one because Dolores Howe again came to me and knew that the 75th anniversary of the village was coming up. And she had been approached by a publisher who was doing these kind of local histories. And she thought it would be great for the 75th
Mm.
anniversary. So, and who's she going to come to but the writer she knows? So she approached me and asked if I would be willing. And she also approached Mary Wager and asked if she would work with me and do the heavy duty research, which I, with all those little kids, did not have time to do. So it was another Dolores Howe thing. And at the time I wrote that book, I didn't even have a computer. I mean, this is 1990, 91.
Yeah.
That was all written on a typewriter. It was lengthy, and I would spend every nap time working like crazy on that book.
Okay. Well, it came out great. So you keep mentioning Dolores Howe. Could you tell some of the people who may not be familiar with her because she's no longer with us, who she is and why she was such a force in Mount Prospect?
Dolores Howe was kind of like a Mrs. Mount Prospect in my mind. She was head of the Chamber of Commerce for a while. She was the editor of a newspaper that no longer exists and has been gone ever since I've lived here, called the Mount Prospect Day.
Hmm.
Uh, she um, she was one of 5 or 6 women who started the Historical Society, and she served as its president for quite a few years. She was literally a force to be reckoned with. And I think of her fondly all the time because she started the teddy bear walk. I mean,
Right.
um, everywhere you look, she had her hand in it in some way for many, many years. I would say from probably 1960 to 1990, she was a force to be reckoned with.
Okay. So you were talking about the 75th anniversary of Mount Prospect, and that was a pretty big to do back then in was that
92.
92? Okay. You helped with that.
I was a member of that commission. I
Yeah,
was not in charge of it by any means, but I
right.
was a member of that commission.
But
And it taught me a lot.
what did it teach you?
Well, I learned how to work with all these different people. When they were setting up that commission, they reached to the library, they reached to the high school district, they reached to the two different elementary school districts, the park districts. Everybody seemed to have a representative on that, and the little Floros was in charge of it, and she was very specific when she asked these organizations who they would send to be their representative. And she said, I don't want somebody who's going to pontificate. I want somebody who's going to work.
Hmm.
So everybody sent their true workers, and they were on that commission.
Can you tell the people a little bit about Lil Floros, who she was?
Lil Floros was a wonderful woman. She um, was married to Leo Floros, who was a longtime Mount Prospect trustee. And if you've ever met somebody who you felt steamrollered by, that would be Lil. She'd call you up and she wouldn't say, oh, would you mind doing this for me? She said, you're going to do this for me.
Okay.
And that's just the way she rolled. So she was put in charge, she and Leo, but mainly she was put in charge of that 75th anniversary committee. And she made sure it all happened. And, this was at a time, once again, there were no computers. So everything had to be done on paper. And we're so spoiled right now, but it was a lot more work back then.
I bet. Yeah. So the out of the 75th anniversary, you had a big party, and from what I hear, people were like, "Hey, this is a great party. Let's do it again." And Celestial Celebration, the Shining Star Gala, was born out of that.
Everybody had such a good time at that 75th party that nobody wanted to let it end. So they started the Celestial Celebration and the Shining Star Awards. I was never involved in that. I did receive one of the awards, but I never was involved in the planning and so forth. I was busy with other things, and they got other people because they
Right.
didn't want to rehash the 75th anniversary committee. But no, it was great, and it's still great today. I think a lot. I'm always amused, or I guess amused is the right word, by Arlington Heights and Park Ridge and all these other towns copying us,
Yes.
because that's exactly what they've done. They all have these kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
events now, but Mount Prospect was the first.
What did you win an award for?
I was the hometown award winner
Okay.
in 1999.
Okay.
And it was basically for, everything, coming up with the house walk, and writing the book, and working for the Daily Herald. And, they kind of rolled it all into one thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was that was kind of at the height of the Shining Star Gala too. I remember that would have been my second Shining Star Gala. Uh, they had people kind of hanging from the rafters at Bristol Court.
Bristol Court was packed with
Yeah.
people. It really was. And everyone thoroughly enjoyed the whole event. And, it was in the middle of winter. It's the first weekend of February. And while that date was chosen because that is the weekend that Mount Prospect was incorporated, that's why that has always happened. It's a great time of year because nobody's got anything else doing. So, you do get a lot of people who make that their winter event.
Yeah, I know a lot of vendors are very happy when we call them, and we don't have to fight with other towns for resources because it's in the middle of winter.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you tell me a little bit about going back to Mount Prospect history? Can you tell us three things that people may not know about Mount Prospect?
Okay. Um, well, you always hear about the Bussies, the Willies, the Mailings, the Mines. Those are the first four families. But they didn't actually come here first.
Right.
There was a man who was a town promoter, they called him in those days, and his name was Ezra Eggleston. And I think there's an Eggleston Street in town, maybe. Anyway, Ezra Eggleston, after the Great Chicago Fire, decided to come out and buy up land from some of the farmers, and and it was along the train tracks, and he wanted to start this town. So he bought up the land, and he's the one who built the original train station, not the one we have now, but the
Right.
original train station, and he had all these grand plans, and then there was a recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, and he ended up going bankrupt. And so the name was on the train station, so Mount Prospect stayed Mount Prospect, but others ended up taking up um, the banner after that.
Yeah, the bussies came in and
Well, actually, the first ones who came in were the mailings.
okay.
There was a general store that was the old mailing, and now it's the
Capanaries.
Capanaries.
Yeah.
Thank you, Capanaries. That was built by Christian Giles back in 1875 or something like that, and he had a general store there. And then he fell in love with a girl from Des Plaines, so he sold his business to the mailings,
Mm-hmm.
and he moved to Des Plaines, which in those days was a hike. Not much of one today, but it was then. And so that's when the mailings came to town. And right on their heels came the Willies. They were coming from Elk Grove, and they wanted to. They started out with a creamery, but then got tired of that, and they ended up going into construction and a tavern. So they built the first tavern. And the two.
Which is it the same one that's Mrs. P and Me?
No,
Oh,
that
oh,
was
it's a
later.
different one.
No,
Oh,
it was
sorry.
on the. It's okay. It was on the north side of the tracks, and it doesn't exist anymore. But it's kind of near. It was kind of near where those new apartments are by
Tw-
Station.
20 West.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, it's on the north side of the tracks,
Yeah.
but it was kind of in that area.
Yeah.
Most everything was north of the tracks for a long time. And the buses did not come here until 1890s.
Okay.
And William Bussey had been living in Elk Grove with his parents and so forth, and then he got um, appointed one of the Cook County sheriffs. And he thought when he took the job that he could just go in once in a while and just do all of his sheriffing out this way. Well, then he found out that they wanted him down in Chicago every day. And so he ended up moving his family to Mount Prospect so he could take the train into Chicago to fulfill his duties.
Okay.
And then he kind of became the king of Mount Prospect, I guess.
He was a mover and shaker.
Oh, he was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
Made a lot of things happen.
Yes, he did. So did I fulfill 3 things? I'm not sure. I kind of lost track.
Yeah, no, I guess that's 3. We could move on, but so since you've been here, how would you say Mount Prospect has changed? What has been the biggest changes?
Well, first of all, when I first came to Mount Prospect, there was no building downtown over 2 stories.
Mm-hmm.
Literally none. There were all small shops. The village hall was an old bank building that was 2 stories with a basement. So, but you could easily walk out of it. I don't think it was a walkout basement, but they had things down there. Where today's village hall was the old library. The new library had been built, but it was 1 story.
Right.
At that point. So there was nothing tall in Mount Prospect. There was an old movie theater that was on the east side of Route 83. Very tiny. They would do those, what's that thing that they always do at midnight with the
Rocky Horror
Rocky
Picture?
Horror, yes.
Yeah.
I remember them always, it seemed like they always had the Rocky Horror movie thing going. There there were a number of little buildings like across the street from Station 54.
34.
34.
Yes.
Okay. There were other buildings over there. There was a toy store. There was a
Yeah.
train store.
Yeah.
There were all kinds of little buildings that way. Um, so it was a low rise downtown. And then at some point, I don't remember exactly when, Arlington Heights started building up, and Mount Prospect felt like they were being left behind, I believe. And so then they started bringing in the taller buildings and building apartments in downtown and wanting to make sure that there were people downtown to patronize the downtown businesses, which was definitely needed. Because when I first got here, there was very little. There was a Hallmark store, there was a um, ice cream store. I mean, there was not a lot going on downtown, and they needed to bring more people right into the downtown in order to patronize build
Yes.
businesses.
Yeah, that's still a thing today. That's they continue to build density to bring in people to patronize businesses, mostly restaurants
Oh,
in
and
the
I
downtown.
neglected to say there was one tall building, the bank building.
Right.
The bank building is like 6 stories, but it was literally the only thing over 2 stories.
Yeah. So, what do you how do you think Mount Prospect manages to keep, or maybe you don't agree, a small town feel? You know, we're a suburb of a major metropolitan community, and I a lot of people say, "Mo-
It's a really difficult balancing act that Mount Prospect has done. And I think that they've done an incredible job when it comes to feeling downtown. And I think part of it is the little festivals and the farmers market every Sunday and the car shows and um, the various events that they hold. Even up at Randhurst, they'll have these little events. And I
mhm,
think that that kind of will give you the hometown feel. The Historical Society has teas and the house walk and various things. I think a lot of it is these different organizations and the village, because the village will do some of those kinds of things
mhm.
too, bringing in a concerted effort, bringing people downtown to socialize with one another and build that feeling of hometown. I,
Community,
yeah,
yeah."
community, hometown, and I think that the more those kinds of events happen, the stronger that feeling of hometown will remain.
So, what? How do you? You were saying that when you first got here, it was all two-story. How do you feel about all the new tall apartments that are being built downtown?
I think it was inevitable, and I think that it will keep Mount Prospect flourishing into the future. I think that we had to have it. We really just had to have it. The there may be some who don't like it, but um, somehow I think that a nice, beautiful building with a grocery store in it is a far cry above a printing plant. I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
weren't taking down anything that I was personally attached to. And they're going to build something in the place of the old police and fire.
Right.
The fact that they moved the police and fire out of the downtown, I thought was brilliant, because there was no reason it had to be right there in the downtown, and this opened up that land for some better use. So I really don't object to those high rise buildings at all, and I don't feel that they're overwhelming. I feel that they fit, they're fine.
Okay. Yeah. So you've been involved for quite a while in village life and kind of with the historical society and whatnot. What would you advise somebody who wants to get more involved with the public life in Mount Prospect? What would you advise them?
Um, I would say you want to get involved in some kind of an organization, like the women's club or the Lions Club or whatever, because you can meet so many people that way. And a lot of the real movers and shakers in this town belong to those organizations. And my husband is a Lion. I'll just tell you as an example, they do a corned beef and cabbage dinner
Mm-hmm.
every November. And it's amazing how many people you can meet at that dinner. Everybody in town, it seems like they all know each other and everybody's there, and you can kind of say, "Hey, I'm looking to get more involved," and they will jump down your throat because everybody is always looking for volunteers and
Right.
looking for help with
Yeah.
all their different activities. Um, I had a friend who recently retired, and she's gotten bored because she's been retired for a few months now. And when she said it to me, I'm like, I'm dragging her into the Historical Society to help out with things because every organization needs help. And all you have to do is say that you're willing or you're interested, and you're going to have a lot of new friends and you're going to have plenty to fill your calendar.
Speaking of the Historical Society, can you give a little kind of advertisement for them? What they do for the town and how you can get involved.
Sure. I have been in the historical study for a long time. We have a board of directors and then a membership. There's a quarterly newsletter that goes out that's usually got some kind of really interesting historical little tidbits that you would never know about, plus information about what's happening in the society. And we do the house walk every year. We also have periodic teas where a speaker will come. There was just one the other day on the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not all real tight on Mount Prospect. It's on any history in particular, in general. We also have events like how to do your genealogy if you're interested in that. So uh, all kinds of different things are going on. Plus, we have a great historic library and files. All of these years when we've done the history of for the house walk, we have made files on all those houses that have
Mm.
been featured. And if your house is one of those, you can go and ask to see the historic information that we have.
Oh,
And I can tell you that every year since this started, I've done the historic research down at the Cook County Torrance office. So all that information is available.
very nice.
Hmm.
Um, so a few years ago, you kind of bookended this whole thing with we had in 1917 we had our centennial, and you helped out with that as well.
2017, yep.
I'm 2017. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes, I was the chairman, co-chairman, because my co-chairman was Leo Floros, who has since passed away. But yeah, I chaired that commission because I had been on the earlier one,
Right.
and they wanted someone who knew how to run it. So I chaired that. We met monthly for 4 years to prepare for that centennial celebration, and I couldn't have been happier with how it all turned out. We did everything from painting fire hydrants all
Mm-hmm.
over town, or we didn't paint them, but we allowed people to paint them. We had another big dinner. We had, I mean, it was just amazing how many different things we had going on that year, and people thoroughly enjoyed it. We even did fireworks off the roof of the village hall, and the fire department is still shaking their heads over that one. They've told me no way ever again. But it was just such a fabulous year. It started in February of 2017, so that was the 100th year. We did a reenactment in the old schoolhouse because
Right.
that's where the papers of incorporation were signed. And we did a reenactment, and it was so much fun. And that was followed by the fireworks. And then there was something every month until it ended in February of 2018.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about why our why the anniversary is in February?
They they wanted to incorporate Mount Prospect, and it was 2016, and they finally got all the paperwork together and so forth to incorporate. But they had one basic problem: they had to have 300 residents, so they had to wait for a baby to be born. And
Because they were at 299.
they were at 299. And so that magic 300th baby was born at the end of January, I believe. And they were able to send the paperwork to Springfield and incorporate right after that.
Yeah, but there was a little snafu with a baby.
Well, there
born.
was an earlier baby in
Yeah.
January who passed away.
Right.
So they had to delay until the next baby was born.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
But so for anybody who, complains about going out in the coldest day of the year in February to get all dressed up and go to Shining Star Gala, that is why.
Imagine how cold they were signing those papers in that drafty little old building,
Yeah.
too.
Having to take it all the way down to Springfield, too,
Yes.
and travel however they traveled in 1917.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
guess is by train, but
Probably,
I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Well, first of all, are we going to get an updated version of this? It's
No.
getting a little bit long.
Yeah, it's old.
It
I just don't know that I have the energy to do an updated version. I keep getting asked. Maybe at some point I'll get weak and say yes, but yeah, that came out in 91, so it's,
yeah,
30 years old.
right. It needs to a little bit's happened in the last 30 years.
Well, there's a number of politicians who'd love to be updated into that.
Uh-huh.
I just haven't agreed to doing it yet. But.
Yeah. All right. Well, we can always hope that you will do that and get it updated, and those politicians can be included.
That's right.
So, what do you think your greatest legacy is going to be in Mount Prospect?
Gosh, that sounds a little presumptuous to think that I would have a legacy, but I think that book, and I think running the Centennial. We did a lot of things that I was very, very proud of. That was a ton of work to put that on. And I think that the people who lived here in 2017 really enjoyed themselves. It was a bitterly cold night when we came out, and everybody watched the fireworks, and there was food everywhere, and everybody really enjoyed themselves. And we had a very special 4th of July parade that year. I mean, literally, this group of us put together something that spread through the whole year. We really didn't miss a month where there wasn't something that honored the legacy of 100 years in Mount Prospect. And I guess I would have to say I feel like we didn't miss a trick. And I think that is great for the committee. We just,
Well, I was there, and yes, it was cold that night, but
Yes,
it was quite an achievement and an accomplishment, and I agree that should be a great thing to be proud of, and a legacy that will live on as well as your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming and talking to us. And,
I enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Mount Podcast. Mount Podcast can be found on your favorite podcast download sites and on the Village website, mountprospect.org. Join us next time as we bring you another conversation with someone worth talking to in Mount Prospect. See you then.